Principle number 4. Why worldviews commit suicide. Do Christians have to check their science at the church door? Michael Egner, a leading brain surgeon, used to think so. After years of rigorous science training, he was sure a scientific worldview was incompatible with any form of religion. Ironically, it was science itself that showed him how mistaken he was. I was raised as an agnostic, and I grew up pretty much as a scientific materialist, Egner told me. He came to regard Christianity as an inspiring set of moral tales, lessons that were spiritually uplifting but not true. Why was he so certain? Because in his view, science had decisively disproved all theistic claims. As a science major in college, Egner said, I was steeped in Darwinian evolution, which seemed to demonstrate that life could be explained perfectly well by material mechanisms alone. There was no reason to invoke God. Darwin's theories seem to have discredited the classic argument from design. Egner's studies also covered Freud, whose theories persuaded him that religion is wish fulfillment, a product of the search for a father figure, a way of working out our internal fears and desires. As a result of his university studies, he told me, every time I even considered Christianity, I was stopped cold by the thought that it would mean abandoning scientific integrity. Over the years, Egner rose to the top of his field. He was appointed professor and vice president of neurosurgery at State University of New York, Stony Brook, and became an award-winning brain surgeon, named one of New York's best doctors by New York Magazine. One of his specialties in the treatment of hydrocephalus, water on the brain. And while developing a theory of blood flow to the brain, his research took a surprising turn. He realized the cranial system he was studying was like an ingenious designed gadget. The filter that protects the delicate capillaries from the pulsating force of the heartbeat is a finely tuned mechanism analogous to vibration dampeners widely used in engineering. In fact, most of what I needed to know was not in biology textbooks, but in engineering textbooks. But what engineers do, of course, is design things. Eventually, Egner realized that virtually all biological research operates on the presumption of design. For example, a standard procedure in biology is called reverse engineering, which is modeled on the kind of thinking you would do if you came across a widget and did not know how it functioned. You would take it apart piece by piece, working backwards to reproduce the engineer's thought process when he originally designed it. That's exactly the kind of analysis that biologists do in the laboratory. They tease apart molecules like proteins or genes, asking what each part does and how they interact to achieve their function. In essence, biologists operate on the basis of design all the time, in practice at least, regardless of which theory they hold. Philosopher Michael Ruse, though himself an outspoken Darwinist, says biology unavoidably relies on design-type thinking. Living things are best explained by discovering what purpose their parts serve. The purpose of the heart is to pump blood. The purpose of the eye is to see. Fins are designed for swimming, and wings for flying. All the components work together in a coherent, coordinated fashion to achieve a goal. We treat organisms, the parts at least, as if they were manufactured, as if they were designed, and then we try to work out their functions, Ruse writes. End-directed thinking, teleological thinking, is appropriate in biology because, and only because, organisms seem as if they were manufactured, as if they were created by an intelligence and put to work. Surprisingly, even Darwin did not deny that the world looks as if it were designed. He merely argued that the appearance of the design is misleading, that the same teleological order can be created by material forces instead. As we saw in principle number 3, the phrase "as if" signals cognitive dissonance. It indicates that certain ideas are inescapable in practice, no matter what a person's worldview says. When a concept, such as design, has to be assumed in order to understand living systems, that is a clue that it is a part of general revelation. It's not brain surgery. Oh wait, yes it is. In Egger's work in the lab as a medical researcher, he ran into some cognitive dissonance again and again. Into the same cognitive dissonance again and again. I was surprised at how little the Darwinian paradigm contributed to my work, he told me. By contrast, the design paradigm aligned nicely with the most important aspect of my research. Eventually, he had to make the decision. When theory and facts contradict one another, which would he follow? Egner's guiding principle was to follow the evidence wherever it leads. He decided the best explanation for why living things function as if they were designed is that they were designed. I came to see that Darwinianism is a philosophical bias more than coherent science. Darwinian process may explain some patterns and changes in gene frequency in populations, but the evidence does not even remotely support the claim that chance and necessity fully account for the appearance of complex design in living things. What about Freud? Freud's notion that religion is wish fulfillment can be turned against its own theory, Egner said. In fact, it is much more plausible that atheism, rather than Christianity, is a form of wish fulfillment. For if there is no God, then there is no one watching. There is no moral accountability, and you can do what you want, as long as you can get away with it. As Polish poet Wacław Mołowicz observed, there is great relief in a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murderers, we are not going to be judged. Egner finally realized that if he were to follow the facts wherever they lead, he would have to accept Christianity. And having a scientist's respect for facts, that's what he did. Immediately he discovered a new sense of unity and wholeness. The biblical God proved to be a sufficient integration point to unify all areas of his life, both professional and personal. Christianity is a worldview conceptually rich enough to account for all of the human experience. Now I see science as rather another way to appreciate the beauty of God's creation, he told me. I bring science into church with me. Truth is unitary. Unitary, yeah. Tests for truth. Egner's story illustrates the two major ways to test a philosophy or worldview. Does it fit the facts? And is it logically consistent? These are the same questions we raise in testing any idea, whether in the science lab, a court of law, or when we're asking a friend why she showed up late. First, does the explanation match what we know about the world? That's the question we asked in Principle 3. Second, does the explanation hold together logically? That is the question we will consider now in Principle number 4. Internal contradictions are fatal to any worldview because contradictory statements are necessarily false. This circle is square, is contradictory, so it has to be false. Scripture assumes that logical contradictories cannot both be true. No lie is of the truth, 1 John 2:21. God never lies, Titus 1:2. God cannot deny himself, 2 Timothy 2:13. An especially damaging form of contradiction is self-referential absurdity, which means a theory set up a definition of truth that it itself fails to meet. Therefore, it refutes itself. You've probably heard the argument from self-referential absurdity in ordinary conversation, even if you don't call it that. To the relativist who says there are no absolutes, there are absolutely no absolutes. To the skeptic who says we can't know anything for sure, do you know that for sure? In each case, the critic is turning the claim back on itself to show that it undercuts itself. It is self-defeating. Apologist Greg Koolk Pinciple likes to say this is how a philosophy commits suicide. When its own criteria are applied to itself, it kills itself. It slits its own throat. People sometimes dismiss this kind of argument as nothing but a snappy put-down or parlor game. A university student who had recently abandoned his Christian upbringing told his parents he now realized there is no absolute truth. When they asked whether that statement itself was absolutely true, he dismissed their response as a rhetorical trick, and refused to engage any longer. In principle number 4, we will discover why it is not a trick, but a valid and powerful form of argument. In fact, we will discover that virtually all idol-based worldviews are self-refuting. Why? Because they are reductionistic. When reductionism is applied to the human mind, it reduces reason to something less than reason. It says that the ideas of our mind are products of natural selection, Darwinism, or economic condition, Marxism, or electrochemical responses in the brain, contemporary neuroscience. Yet, the only way a worldview can build its own case is by using reason. Thus, when it discredits reason, it undercuts its own case. It is self-defeating. Of course, most worldviews are plagued by a variety of logical difficulties and contradictions. To track each one individually would seem an endless task, but because idol-centered worldviews are all reductionistic, this one fundamental flaw is predictable. Learning to identify it will empower you to a laser-focused strategy that can apply to any and every worldview you encounter. As soon as Christians raise the problem of contradictions, we are likely to get pushback from people claiming that Christianity itself contains contradictions. They point to the doctrine of the Trinity or to Jesus' paradoxical statements such as, "You must lose your life in order to save it." But these are not genuine logical contradictions. In logic, the law of non-contradiction states that two antithetical propositions cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Biblical theology does not say that God is one in the same sense that God is three. And Jesus was using paradoxical language to make a point. A paradox is an apparent contradiction. His statements were plays on words to catch people's attention, but they were not logical contradictions. More to the point, Christianity is not self-referentially absurd, because it is not reductionistic regarding human reason. It is not self-refuting. It does not commit suicide. Principle number 4, test the idol. Does it contradict itself? To see why the argument from self-referential absurdity is not just a rhetorical trick, let's start with a historical example. Throughout much of the 20th century, American academia was dominated by an extreme form of empiricism called logical positivism. As we saw earlier, classic empiricism puts everything into the box of the senses. Any statement that cannot be tracked back to sense impressions is rejected as false. Logical positivism took this claim a step further. It insisted that any statement not reducible to sense impressions is not just false, but cognitively meaningless. That is, not even subject to standards of true and false. Take, for example, a moral statement such as slavery is unjust. Justice is not something you can stuff into the test tube or study under a microscope. The logical positivists argue that therefore the sentence slavery is unjust has no cognitive content. It is merely an expression of personal feelings or preference. It really means I don't like slavery. This view of morality is sometimes called emotivism because it reduces moral statements to expressions of emotion like saying boo or hooray. And hooray is not something that can be true or false. A moral statement may be important to the person saying it, but according to logical positivism, it is cognitively meaningless and it is literally nonsense. This view of morality has percolated through all levels of society. After all, it is much easier to dismiss someone's views by saying, "That's just a value judgment," and treating it as a subjective preference instead of examining it seriously as a valid candidate for truth. What happened, though, when the test of logical positivism was applied to itself? Its central claim was that the statements are meaningful only if they are empirically testable. But is that statement empirically testable? Of course not. It's not an empirical observation. It is a metaphysical rule, an arbitrary definition of what qualifies as knowledge. Thus, when the criterion of logical positivism was applied to itself, it was discredited. It stood self-condemned. Logical positivism had been so influential for such a long time that its collapse sent shockwaves all through the intellectual world. Its fall was the most important philosophical event of the 20th century, says William Lane Craig. The strategy of applying philosophy's own standards of truth to itself proved to be no mere rhetorical trick. It is a powerful tool for testing truth claims, and it can be applied to many other philosophies to show that they are self-destruct in the same way. Hitting the marks. The key to identify where a worldview commits suicide is to uncover its particular form of reductionism. Any theory that says truth claims are nothing but X is susceptible to self-refutation. For example, Karl Marx said that truth claims are nothing but realizations of economic interests. Laws are created by the rich to protect their property. Religion is the opiate of the people, placating the poor with false promises of a happy afterlife. But what happens if we apply Marx's rule to his own theory? Did he create it merely to rationalize his own economic interests? If so, we can dismiss it as a serious truth claim. The theory commits suicide. Or take Friedrich Nietzsche. He held that all human action is driven by the will to power. Morality is invented by the weak to give them leverage over the strong. Religion is a holy lie used to control people. But what about Nietzsche's own theory? Was it driven by his own will to power? Then why should the rest of us pay any attention to it? The theory undercuts itself. Sigmund Freud insists that our thoughts are shaped by unconscious emotional needs. Personality is shaped by things like early toilet training. Much of a human behavior is a result of sexual repression. But what does that imply about the origin of Freud's own theory? Onto the couch yourself, Dr. Freud. The behaviorist B.F. Skinner held that humans are nothing but stimulus-response mechanisms responding to rewards and punishments. Their behavior is examinable in terms of apparent conditioning, like the pigeons in his experiments, pecking at levers to get a pellet of food. But is Skinner's theory a product of its own conditioning? The theory refutes itself. What these philosophies all share is a refusal to take truth claims at face value. Instead, they interpret them as cover-ups for hidden motives and disguised self-interest. This penchant for debunking has been labeled the hermeneutics of suspicion, hermeneutics in the science of interpretation. Those who practice it have been dubbed the masters of suspicion. To be logically consistent, however, the masters should practice equal suspicion towards their own views, which they rarely, if ever, do. As a tool of critical thinking, a hermeneutics of suspicion can be useful to highlight common human failings, to diagnose the ways our thinking may be distorted by things like economic interests or psychological impulses. Scripture teaches that we deceive ourselves all the time about our true motives. The heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? Jeremiah 17:9. Taken on its own terms, however, a hermeneutics of suspicion is radically reductionistic. It simply abandons the question of truth, reducing it to questions of power and desire. Debunking the debunkers. Showing the theories that commit suicide is an essential tool to any apologetics toolbox. What is unique about the Romans 1 approach is that it explains why the arguments work. Because idol-based worldviews are reductionistic. By deifying something lower than the biblical God, they also recast humans in the image of something lower. The process of reductionism includes human cognitive faculties, things like reason, logic, rationality. It reduces human rationality to some non-rational force or process. Yet, once a theory makes the claim that our ideas are not the product of rational thought, that claim must be applied to all ideas, including the theory itself. The debunkers end up debunking their own theories. Or they would if they were consistent. To avoid discrediting their own views, the debunkers tacitly exempt themselves from critique they use to discredit everyone else. They act as if they are not blinded by the same irrational forces they distort and bias everyone else's views. They are mysteriously able to raise above the forces that enslave everyone else. They alone are capable of achieving an unattained insight into reality. Even though they have stuffed the entire universe into a box, strangely, they themselves are not trapped in that box. They somehow have the power to float above the box, rendering their own theories objectively valid and true. But of course, by carving out an exception for themselves, they have introduced a logical inconsistency into their system. They have stated that there is one thing, namely their own thinking, that their system does not cover. Either way, then, idol-based worldviews are logically contradictory, which means they fail. By contrast, a Christian worldview is not reductionistic. It does not reduce reason to something less than reason, and therefore it does not self-destruct. A Christian epistemology, theory of knowledge, starts with the transcendent Creator who spoke the entire universe into being with His Word. And God said, Genesis 1:3. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. John uses a Greek word logos that means not only word, but also reason or rationality, the underlying principle that unifies the world in an orderly cosmos, as opposed to randomness and chaos. The Greeks who heard John's gospel understood that he was claiming that Christ is the source of order and coherence in the universe. This biblical view has two crucial implications. First, the intelligible order of the universe reflects the mind of the Creator. Second, because God created humans in His image, our minds correspond with that order as well. There is a congruence between the structure of the world and the structure of the human cognition. A correlation between subject and object in the act of knowing. As Plantinga writes, God created both us and our world in such a way that there is a certain fit or match between the world and our cognitive facilities. The medievals used the phrase acquisitio intellectus ad rem, which means the intellectual is adequate to reality. Of course, humans are broken, fallen creatures, and as a result, our thought processes are darkened and distorted. Nevertheless, even after the fall, we are still human. We still retain the image of God. Throughout history, the Bible has inspired confidence in the essential reliability of human cognitive facilities. Biblical epistemology is backed up experientially by general revelation. To function from day to day, humans have to assume that we do know a great many things, that the material world is real, the chair I'm sitting on will hold me up, that the universe works by cause and effect. If I drop this computer, it will fall. That mathematical truths hold universally. 5 plus 7 always will equal 12. That our memories are basically reliable. I did eat a sandwich for lunch today. That other people have minds, even though I cannot directly see them. And that the laws of logic are valid. To discredit logic, I have to argue using logic. In our daily actions, we have to assume the basic reliability of human cognition. If we are complete skeptics, we would be paralyzed, unable to act. Anything we must assume in order to function in the world is part of general revelation. The undeniable facts of experience reflect the created structure of the physical nature or human nature, or both. They are signposts pointing to the biblical God. Only a biblical worldview explains why it is possible for humans to have trustworthy knowledge. The upshot is that all worldviews have to borrow a Christian epistemology, at least at the moment they are making their claims. They must tacitly assume the reliability of reason and rationality, which only a biblical worldview supports. They have to function as if Christianity is true, even if they reject it. C.S. Lewis unmasks materialism. To practice the skill of detecting self-referential absurdity, let's dissect a few more examples. Because materialism, or naturalism, is the unquestioned assumption of much of academia, let's begin with it. Materialism claims that my thoughts are products of physical events. What does that mean? It means that when I calculate that 5 plus 7 equals 12, or when I perceive a rose as red, or when I judge that torturing people is evil, what is really happening is that my brain is doing physical things like producing chemical reactions and causing neurons to fire. As a case in point, a recent book expounding materialism claims that ideas are physical states of matter within our brains. Thus, a thought process is a series of brain states, a series of physical configurations of matter, each causing the next in accordance with the deterministic laws that govern the interactions of physical objects. In other words, the thought produced by your brain is akin to the sweat secreted by your glands or the digestive juice produced by your stomach. The problem is that digestion is not something that can be true or false. It is just a biological fact. If our thoughts are also biological facts, determined by biological laws, then they are not the sort of thing that can be true or false either. But that has to include our thoughts about materialism, which undercuts the claim to be true. When the implications of materialism are applied to itself, it commits suicide. C.S. Lewis makes a similar argument in several of his writings. Here is an example. If minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry, in the long run, on meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees. Lewis then shows how this view defeats itself. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. How do atheists or materialists avoid that self-refuting conclusion? They make what C.S. Lewis calls a tacit exception for their own theory, at least at the moment they are stating their claims. In building their case, they must implicitly trust their own thinking. They must exempt themselves from their own reductive categories of analysis. As one philosopher says, the materialist functions as though he were an angelic observer, however, somehow able to float above the determinist cage in which he locks everyone else. In essence, materialists must tacitly assume a Christian epistemology, at least when they are arguing for their claims. Indeed, the sheer act of asserting materialism contradicts itself. If I say everything that exists is material, is that statement self-material? Is it merely a series of sound waves? If I write out the statement, is it nothing but marks on a piece of paper? Of course not. The statement has a linguistic meaning. It has logical properties. It has a social function, communicating to others, all of which transcend the material dimension. Ironically, materialism cannot even be stated without refuting itself. Because humans are whole and integrated beings, we should accept our thoughts to be accompanied by physical events in the brain. But if we reduce thought processes to brain processes, the result is a logical contradiction. Evolution cannot survive itself. Another example of self-referential absurdity is a theory called evolutionary epistemology, a naturalistic approach that applies evolution to the process of knowing. The theory proposes that the human mind is a product of natural selection. The implication is that the ideas in our minds were selected for their survival value, not for their truth value. But what if we apply that theory to itself? Then it, too, was selected for survival. Not true, which discredits its own claim to truth. Evolutionary epistemology commits suicide. Astonishingly, many proponent thinkers have embraced the theory without detecting the logical contradiction. Philosopher John Gray writes, "If Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth." What is the contradiction in that statement? Gary has essentially said, if Darwin's theory is true, then it serves evolutionary success, not truth. In other words, if Darwin's theory is true, then it is not true. Referential absurdity is akin to the well-known liar's paradox. This statement is a lie. If the statement is true, then, as it says, it is not true, but a lie. Another example is Francis Crick in The Astonishing Hypothesis. He writes, "Our highly developed brains, after all, were not evolved under the pressure of discovering scientific truths, but only to enable us to be clever enough to survive." But that means Crick's own theory is not a scientific truth. Applied to itself, the theory commits suicide. Of course, the sheer pressure of to survive is likely to produce some correct ideas. A zebra that thinks lions are friendly will not live long, but false ideas may be useful for survival. Evolutionists admit as much. Eric Baum says, "Sometimes you are more likely to survive and propagate if you believe a falsehood than if you believe the truth." Steven Pinker writes, "Our brains were shaped for fitness, not for truth. Sometimes the truth is adaptive, but sometimes it is not." The upshot is that survival is no guarantee of truth. If survival is the only standard, we can never know which ideas are true and which ideas are adaptive but false. To make the dilemma even more puzzling, evolutionists tell us that natural selection has produced all sorts of false concepts in the human mind. In principle number 3, we read about evolutionary materialists who maintain that free will is an illusion, consciousness is an illusion, even our sense of self is an illusion, and that all these false ideas were selected for their survival value. So how can we know whether the theory of evolution itself is one of those false ideas? The theory undercuts itself. A few thinkers, to their credit, recognize the problem. Literary critic Leon Wieseltier writes, "If reason is a product of natural selection, then how much confidence can we have in a rational argument for natural selection? Evolutionary biology cannot invoke the power of reason even as it destroys it." On a similar note, philosopher Thomas Nagel asks, "Is the evolutionary hypothesis really compatible with the continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge?" His answer is no. I have to be able to believe that I follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I am biologically programmed to do so. Hence, insofar as the evolutionary hypothesis itself depends on reason, it would be self-undermining. Darwin's selective skepticism. People are sometimes under the impression that Darwin himself recognized the problem. They typically cite Darwin's famous horrid doubt passage where he questions whether the human mind can be trustworthy if it is a product of evolution. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. But of course, Darwin's theory itself was a conviction of man's mind. So why should it be all trustworthy? Surprisingly, however, Darwin never confronted his internal contradiction in this theory. Why not? Because he expressed his horrid doubt selectively, only when considering the case for a creator. From time to time, Darwin admitted that he still found the idea of God persuasive. He once confessed his inward conviction that the universe is not the result of chance. It was in the next sentence that he expressed his horrid doubt. So the conviction he mistrusted was his lingering conviction that the universe is not the result of chance. In another passage, Darwin admitted, "I feel compelled to look to a first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man." Again, however, he immediately veered off into skepticism. But then arises the doubt, can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, developed from the mind of the low as that possessed by the lowest animal, to be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? That is, can it be trusted when it draws grand conclusions about a first cause? Perhaps the concept of God is merely an instinct programmed into us by a natural selection, Darwin added, like a monkey's instinctive fear and hatred of snakes. In short, it was on occasions when Darwin's mind led him to a theistic conclusion that he dismissed the mind as untrustworthy. He failed to recognize that, to be logically consistent, he needed to apply the same skepticism to his own theory. Modern followers of Darwin still apply the theory selectively. Harvard paleontologist Stephen J. Gould wrote, "Darwin applied a consistent philosophy of materialism to his interpretation of nature, in which mind, spirit, and God as well are just words that express the wondrous results of neuronal complexity." In other words, God is an idea that appears in the human mind when the electrical circuitry of the brain has evolved to a certain level of complexity. To be logically consistent, however, Gould should turn the same skepticism back into Darwin's ideas, which he never did. Gould applied his evolutionary skepticism selectively to discredit the idea of God. Applied consistently, Darwinism undercuts not only itself, but also the entire scientific enterprise. Kenan Malik, a writer trained in neurobiology, writes, "If our cognitive capacities were simply evolved dispositions, there would be no way of knowing which of these capacities lead to true beliefs and which lead to false ones. Thus, to view humans as little more than sophisticated animals undermines confidence in the scientific method. Just so, science itself is at stake." John Lennox, professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, writes that according to atheism, the mind that does science is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, if you knew your computer was the product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it. So, to me, atheism undermines the rationality I need to do science. Of course, the atheist pursuing his research has no choice but to rely on rationality, just as everyone else does. The point is that he has no philosophical basis for doing so. Only those who affirm a rational creator have a basis for trusting human rationality. The reason so few atheists and materialists seem to recognize the problem is that, like Darwin, they apply their skepticism selectively. They apply it to undercut only ideas they reject, especially ideas about God. They make a tacit exception for their own worldview commitments. Why science is a miracle. It is clear now why Christianity played a significant role in launching the scientific revolution in the first place. Only a biblical worldview provides an adequate epistemology for science. First, a rational God created the world with an intelligible structure. And second, he created humans in his image. In the words of historian Richard Cohen, science required the concept of rational creator of all things, along with the corollary that we, lesser rational beings, might, by virtue be like that godlike rationality, be able to decipher the laws of nature. Theologian Christopher Kaiser states that the same idea the early scientists assumed that the same logos that is responsible for its ordering is also reflected in human reason. For the early scientists, the image of God was not a dry doctrine to which they gave merely cognitive assent, nor was it purely motivated private faith. They treated it as a public truth, the epistemological foundation for the entire scientific enterprise. Their goal, they said, was to think God's thoughts after him. At the time of the scientific revolution, biblical epistemology was the guarantee that the human mind is equipped to gain genuine knowledge of the world. And it still is today. A widely quoted essay by Eugene Wigner is titled "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences." Wigner says why the mathematical formulas we devise in our heads work so well in describing the external universe. The match between them is something bordering on the mysterious. Indeed, there is no rational explanation for it. No explanation, that is, within scientific materialism. It is difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us, Wigner muses. At the very least, certainly, it is hard to believe that our reasoning power was brought by Darwin's process of natural selection to the perfection to which it seems to possess. By contrast, a biblical worldview offers a perfectly reasonable explanation for the effectiveness of mathematics, namely, that a rational God created humans in his image to think his thoughts after him. In fact, looking at history, we find that a biblically inspired confidence in the mathematical structure of the universe came first, before any actual scientific discoveries. Mathematician Morris Klein writes, "The early mathematicians were sure of the existence of mathematical laws underlying natural phenomena, and persisted in the search for them because they were convinced a priori that God had incorporated them in the construction of the universe. People must first be convinced there is a mathematical order in nature. Otherwise, they will not go searching for it, and science will not get off the ground." What this means is that even today, anyone who wants to pursue science has to adopt an epistemology derived from the biblical worldview, at least in practice. To do science, even the most hard-boiled atheist must function as if Christianity were true. Postmodern prison. What about postmodernism? What happens to it if we apply the test of self-referential absurdity? As we saw earlier, postmodernism absolutizes the social group. It claims that individuals are largely constituted by their membership in a community. When we absorb the language of our community, in process, we absorb its worldview, the storyline or narrative it evokes to explain the world. Thus, when we speak, we are only externalizing a storyline that we first assimilated. Postmodernists express this idea using paradoxical statements like, language speaks to us rather than we speak to it. Oh, weird. Language speaks us rather than we speak it. The point is that we cannot even think apart from the language we have assimilated from our community. Nietzsche, with his typical flair, wrote that we are trapped in the prison house of language. Because worldviews are transmitted through language, postmodernists use the metaphor of language games. Just as baseball and football are games with virtually no rules in common, so worldviews are said to be language games, each with its unique set of rules. Each community has its own language game for making sense of the world, what Jean-Francis Lyotard calls little narratives. But there is no universal narrative, no meta-narrative that is valid for all human beings at all times. In Lyotard's words, there is no possibility that language games can be unified or totalized in any meta-discourse. Yet, what reasons can Lyotard give us for accepting this theory? Isn't his own view just one more language game that, like all the others? Isn't he trapped in the prison house of his own language, just like everyone else? Then why should we pay attention to it? Postmodernism is an example of what is called a performative contradiction, which means that a position is contradicted in the very act of being asserted. Everyday examples of a performative contradiction include saying in English, "I cannot speak English," or "I do not exist." To make the statement, "I must exit." When a postmodernist asserts that there is no universally valid truth, he is implicitly claiming that his own assertion is universally valid and true. To make the statement has to accompany the transcendental position that postmodernism says is not there to be occupied. Thus, every time a postmodernist states his position, he contradicts it. The position is self-refuting. Barthes busted. When postmodern thought was applied to literary theory, it gave rise to an offshoot called deconstructionism. Recall that for postmodernism, individuals are constituted by their membership within a community. The implication is that the individuals do not really have original creative ideas, but merely reflect the ideas of their communities. For example, literary critic Roland Barthes says a piece of writing is merely a tissue of quotations, absorbed from the surrounding culture. Barthes is best known for his slogan, "The death of the author," by which he means the death of the very concept of individual creativity. In his view, writers are akin to the bards or shamans of old, who were not inventors of their own stories so much as transmitters of the stories of their clan, tribe, or community. Jacques Derrida means the same thing in his paradoxical statement, "Texts have no author." Moreover, we all belong to a variety of communities based on attributes such as race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity, all with conflicting outlooks and interests. As a result, every author will unconsciously reflect conflicting social messages. For Barthes, a text is a mix in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The goal of the literary critic is to dig beneath the surface of the text, to excavate and disentangle those clashing meanings. This is called deconstructing the text, hence the term deconstructionism. What reason does Barthes give for accepting such a theory? As Alan Jacobs writes, as soon as deconstructionists get in the business of providing reasons, they are perforce in the business of making claims and thus are subject to their own critique. What happens if we subject Barthes' views to his own critique? We have to conclude that he too is merely a mouthpiece for social forces such as race, class, and gender. His own writings do not offer original or creative insights, but are merely collages of conflicting quotations absorbed unconsciously from the communities to which he belongs. The death of the author must include Barthes himself. In practice, the only way deconstructionists can function is to tacitly exempt themselves from the critique they apply to everyone else. They presume to stand above the fray, with unique insight to deconstruct everyone else's statements as products of underlying interests and power struggles, while treating their own writings as immune to the process of deconstruction. They write as though they alone are able to transcend the social forces of race, class, and gender that render everyone else a victim of false consciousness. Thus, ironically, postmodernists contradict their own views every time they write a book or article. Deconstructionists hope their own work will be treated as a serious contribution from a creative mind, not merely a reply of cultural messages. They continue to author books arguing that there is no author. Theologian Mark C. Taylor, himself a postmodernist, explains that the death of the author was an inevitable result of the death of God. The death of God was the disappearance of the author, who had inscribed absolute truth and unequivocal meaning in world history. And because humans are made in the image of God, Taylor concludes, the death of God implies the disappearance of the author. For if there is no creator, then humans do not have the dignity of being sub-creators. They are merely products of social and historical forces. Postmodernism and terror. To understand the source of postmodernism, we must place its founders in their historical context. Why were they so opposed to grand meta-narratives? The answer is that they viewed them as the source of brutal, oppressive political regimes. Most of the founders of postmodernism were Europeans who had witnessed firsthand history's bloodiest and most oppressive political systems, Nazism and communism. As we saw in principle number 2, both these systems centered on a single principle, race, Nazism, or economic class, communism. Both embraced a grand vision of history moving inexorably toward some ideal society, and both became totalitarian, using their utopian visions to justify secret police and death camps. After World War II, many European thinkers who had suffered under these oppressive regimes decided that the source of totalitarianism lay in totalizing meta-narratives. By totalizing, they meant a worldview that focuses on a single dimension of human experience, evaluating it to a false absolute and subordinating everything else to its categories. When a one-dimensional, totalizing worldview gains political power, those who disagree will be marginalized, oppressed, left out, silenced, dominated, co-opted, controlled, and coerced. They will be stigmatized as different, perceived as the other, locked up in concentration camps. All must bow to the state-enforced idol, or be burned in the fiery furnace of oppression. Postmodernists' insight into the dynamics of false absolutes should sound familiar. We've been making a similar critique, showing how idols are created when some part of creation is absolutized. The mistake postmodernists made was to think the source of the problem was a commitment to any comprehensive truth. In the postmodern condition, Lyotard says, the conviction that there is only one truth, the whole truth, leads inevitably to terror. The 19th and 20th centuries have given us as much terror as we can take. We have paid a high price for the nostalgia of the whole and the one truth. Postmodernists concluded that the way to change claims to absolute power was to challenge claims to absolute truth. As Eagleton puts it, postmodernism makes the mistake of supposing that all passionate conviction is implicitly dogmatic and will end up with the Gulag. Why is that a mistake? Because it is self-refuting. By rejecting any universal truth, postmodernism undercuts its own claim to truth. Moreover, without some universal standard of justice, there is no way to stand against injustice and oppression, the very things postmodernists were so concerned about. As one philosopher writes, without timeless and universal moral principles, it seems that we cannot criticize the values of different cultures or times, no matter how repugnant they may seem. Think of it this way: if all claims can be deconstructed, then what about the claim that the rich should not oppress the poor, or that we should resist bigotry and racism? Those claims, too, can be deconstructed. Thus, postmodernism may appear to be radical, but as Jacobs writes, it is in fact unable to offer resistance to the political status quo. Lived out consistently, postmodernism leads to complicity with evil and injustice. The tyranny of diversity. Lived out consistently, the theory also leads to the coercive suppression of diversity. That may sound ironic at first, because it was postmodernism that made diversity such a potent buzzword in the first place. Postmodernists decided that if totalitarianism results from totalizing meta-narratives, the way to prevent concentrations of power is to maintain a variety of mini-narratives. By celebrating the diversity of communities and their language games, postmodernists hope to avoid the coercion of a society organized by a single absolutized category. In practice, however, only select groups are singled out to represent diversity. Certified victim groups based on things like race, class, gender, ethnic group, and sexual identity. Rarely is there a push for intellectual or political or theological diversity, when those views run counter to postmodernism. And the analysis of the problem is typically derived from Marxism. Some group is said to be victimized and oppressed, and the path to liberation is to revolt against the oppressors, often through political activism. This explains why the typical university campus has become thoroughly politicized. In many English departments, literary criticism no longer deals with issues of aesthetics, such as style, structure, and composition. Instead, the trend is to apply Marxist criticism, or feminist criticism, or whatever critics' preferred theory is. Writing in the Chronicle of Higher Education, one English professor said the goal of literary study is to help students decide which side of the world historical class struggle they take, the side of the owners of the means of production, or the side of the workers. This, and only this, is the real question in textual literacies. Frank Lentricia, a critic so radical he was once dubbed the Dirty Harry of the literary theory, was finally disillusioned when he observed his own students developed a suffocating sense of moral superiority. They would pass judgment on authors as racist or sexist or capitalist or imperialist or homophobic before even reading their works. In dismay, Lentricia said, "Tell me your literary theory, and I'll tell you in advance what you'll say about any work of literature, especially those you haven't read." Politically correct university courses are not liberating students to think for themselves. They are turning students into cadres of self-absorbed reactionaries ready to take orders from the faddish theorist of the moment. Bruno Latour, a sociologist of science, likewise grew concerned about the oppressive impact of the critical theory that he himself helped found. The attraction of postmodern criticism, he writes, is that it allows you to pose as the superior thinker who humiliates naive believers by deconstructing their beliefs. You are always right, Latour says. Their behavior is entirely determined by the action of powerful casualties coming from objective reality that they don't see, but that you, yes, you alone can see. Postmodernism began with the noble goal of unmasking the implicit imperialism of modernist worldviews, but ironically it has been itself become imperialist, insisting that postmodernists alone have the ability to unmask everyone else's underlying interests and motives, to deconstruct and debunk them. It thereby essentially silences every other perspective. Worse, if you do not share postmodernism's specific definition of diversity, it is likely to be imposed by force. An article in the Atlantic Observer that political correctness morphed into a tyranny of speech codes, sensitivity training, and book banning. They drive for diversity, which was supposed to be the safeguard for liberty. Yet has itself become coercive and homogenizing. Diversity has become a code word for a new form of tyranny. Losing yourself. I recently met friends who were grieving because their daughter had rejected her Christian upbringing, surprisingly, at a conservative Christian college. Her major was English, a subject most parents regard as relatively safe, where students read Shakespeare and Dickens. Even at evangelical colleges, however, many faculty members have embraced elements of postmodernism and deconstructionism. Within a short time, my friend's daughter came to question whether there was such a thing as truth at all, including the biblical truth she had been taught in her home and church. How can we prepare young people for the postmodern theories they will encounter in the classroom? Like every worldview, postmodernism offers genuine insights, especially in its critique of modernism. The Enlightenment held an exalted view of the autonomous individual in possession of disembodied reason, often capitalized, which supposedly lifted him above his tiny slot in time and space to deliver a timeless, objective truth. By contrast, postmodernism insists that knowledge is always contextual. Persons are not disembodied consciousnesses. They are physical beings situated within communities, and their worldviews are colored by cultural traditions, economic interests, and power relations. Yet, in reacting against the Enlightenment, postmodernism falls off the horse on the other side. It reduces the individual to a patchwork of historical and social forces, with no stable personal identity. The reason goes back to Hegel's historicism, the idea that humanity is caught up in the ceaseless flux of evolution. The implication is that there is no such thing as human nature, no stable, ideal blueprint for what it means to be human, no universal standard to tell us who we are and how to fulfill our true nature. As the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre put it, there is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. Just as species are constantly changing and evolving, so individuals must leave behind all stable standards and immerse themselves in the ceaseless flux of life, constantly creating and recreating themselves. To use postmodern terms, the self is fluid and fragmented. Michael Foucault says his goal is the disassociation of the self, by showing that our sense of being a coherent self is in reality an empty synthesis of past events. What actually does that mean? One philosopher explains that for Foucault, our identities are fictional anyway, just each of us is plural, a congeries of forces pulling in many directions. But if our identities are fictional, then who is Foucault? And who is really speaking in his writings? When a postmodernist states that it is impossible to attain objectivity, is that an objective statement? The theory undercuts its own claims. Moreover, it runs contrary to human experience. Each of us experiences the inescapable, irresistible sense of being a coherent self, an active center of consciousness, not merely a passive locus of colliding social forces. Even as we undergo life changes, we are aware of an enduring core personal identity. The universality of this first-person awareness, even among those whose worldview denies it, is a clue that it is intrinsic to human experience. We are so constituted that we cannot live consistently on the basis of the postmodernists' radical reductionism, and neither can they. The truths of general revelation cannot ultimately be suppressed. The Trinity for postmoderns. The problem of how to balance our individual identity with our membership in communities is a perennial question known in philosophy as the one and the many, or unity and diversity. Christianity offers an answer that is surprising and unique. It teaches that the human race was created in the image of a God who is a tri-unity, three persons so intimately related as to constitute one Godhead. God's own nature consists in reciprocal love and communication among the persons of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. But the one and the many, both individuality and relationship, exist within the divine nature. The perfect balance of unity and diversity within the Trinity offers a model for human social life and a solution to the opposing poles of postmodernism and modernism. Against postmodernism's dissolution of the self, the Trinity implies the dignity of the individual self. Just as each person within the Trinity is distinct and plays a unique role in the drama of salvation, so each individual person has a unique identity and purpose. Yet, against modernism and its radical individualism, the Trinity implies that we are not disconnected and autonomous, but were created for relationship. Sociality is built into the very essence of human nature. Aside from the effects of sin, there is an intrinsic harmony between that with what fulfills us as individuals and what fulfills us in our relationships, marriage, family, work, church, ethnic groups. There is no inherent conflict between being true to oneself and participating in the God-ordained relationships that connect us to one another. Christianity agrees with the postmodernist critique of the Enlightenment's notion of the disembodied consciousness. The Bible teaches that God created humans as embodied beings, biologically connected to families, living in particular nations at particular periods in history. We are rooted in the physical material world, and that is not a negative limitation that must be transcended. On the contrary, Genesis states repeatedly that the material creation was intrinsically good, and God saw that it was good. In the book of Acts, Paul even teaches that our physical, social, and historical situatedness is intended by God as a means to draw us to Him. Speaking about the nations, from the Greek ethnos, root of ethnic group, Paul says, God determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live, so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Acts 17:26 and 27. Our biological and social identity is intended to be a blessing, to inspire us to search for God. At the same time, Christianity refuses to reduce individuals to their communities, as postmodernism does. Christians are reborn into a redeemed community that transcends all natural communities. Even the family, the most basic biological community, does not determine our primary identity. All who become Christians are children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will to have a child, but born of God. John 1:12 and 13. The Bible's liberating message is the promise that we can transcend the sin and brokenness of our natural communities because our primary identity is to be children of God. This Trinitarian view produces a wonderful balance in practice. Within the church, diversity based on physical origins, birth, family, gender, ethnicity, nationality, can be celebrated with gratitude as gifts from God. At the same time, these things do not ultimately define us. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Colossians 3:11. Remarkably, an atheist Marxist philosopher has written movingly of the gospel's liberating legacy. Slavoj Zizek says Christianity teaches that we are not bound by the chains of our past, that we can disengage ourselves from the inertia that constrains us to identify with the particular order we were born into. Christianity offers a unique balance of unity and diversity, of particularity and universality. The church itself is intended to be a powerful apologetic, a visible, living expression of the Bible's balanced view. Every local church is a letter from Christ, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, says 2 Corinthians 3:3. When outsiders read that letter, they should see the Trinitarian view of community lived out, not perfectly, but in a credible way. Jesus even said that people will judge whether Christianity is true by the Trinitarian love they witness in the church. As the Father and the Son are one, so Jesus prayed that all Christians may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me. John 17:23. Francis Schaeffer called the visible manifestation of love among Christians the final apologetic, the single thing most likely to attract the attention of the jaded world. The message of our words will bear fruit only when confirmed by the message of our lives. Escape from reductionism. Understanding reductionism equips us with a powerful means to destroy arguments raised against the knowledge of God, as 2 Corinthians 10:5 says. In principle number 3, identifying reductionism was key to showing how idol-based worldviews contradict reality. In principle number 4, identifying reductionism is the clue to showing how worldviews self-destruct. As we topple idols, it is imperative that we replace it with something better. If the core flaw is reductionism, then the way to build a positive case for Christianity is to show that it is not reductionistic, because it does not deify any part of creation. It does not have to cram everything into a single set of categories. The result is that Christianity has a very rich ontology, theory of what exists. It offers a greater respect for creation than any competing worldview. Consider how positive it is by comparison. Materialism. To counter materialism, we can show that a biblical worldview teaches an even greater respect for the material world. The physical universe is not just a product of chance. The earth is not a rock spinning through empty space, with no higher purpose or meaning. Instead, the physical universe was brought into being by a God of love and beauty. It is a product of plan and design. Fascinatingly, the early church also had to defend a high view of the material world, though for different reasons. Ancient Greek culture was permeated with philosophies such as Gnosticism and Neoplatonism that regarded the material realm as the realm of death, decay, and destruction. Gnosticism taught that the world was so evil that it could not be the creation of the highest, supreme deity but must be the handiwork of an evil subdeity. The supreme God would not demean himself by mucking about with matter. Gnosticism denigrated the physical body as the prison house of the soul. The goal of salvation was to escape from the physical realm and leave it behind. In this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary. It teaches that there is only one God and that he created matter. It is therefore intrinsically good. Christianity's greatest scandal, however, was the incarnation, the claim that God himself took a physical body. He was not an avatar who just appeared to be human, as the Gnostics taught. He actually became human. The incarnation grants an astonishingly high dignity to the material world. Even more revolutionary, after Jesus had escaped the physical world, after he died, he came back in a bodily resurrection. To the Greeks, this was not spiritual progress, it was regress. Why would anyone want to come back into the material world, the realm of evil and corruption? The whole idea was utter foolishness to the Greeks. 1 Corinthians 1:23. Finally, what will happen at the end of time according to Scripture, God is not going to scrap the idea of a physical universe and replace it with a purely ethereal plane of being, as though he had made a mistake the first time. Instead, he is going to replace it with a new earth, said in Revelation 21:1. And you and I will live on that new earth in new physical bodies. In the Apostles' Creed, Christians affirm the resurrection of the body. This is an astonishingly high view of the physical world. Christianity imparts greater value to the material realm than any version of materialism. Empiricism. To counter empiricism, Christians can show that a biblical worldview offers a better basis for trusting our senses. As we saw earlier, the flaw in empiricism is that it cannot give any guarantee that what we perceive through the sense is true. We cannot stand outside our heads to gain an independent vantage point from which to test sense data against the external world. The only adequate basis for confidence in sensory knowledge is the biblical teaching that a creator designed our sensory apparatus to function reliably in the world that he created. The doctrine of creation is the epistemological guarantee that the constitution of our human facilities conforms the structure of the external world. It is part of human design plan, writes Plantinga, to trust our sense perceptions. When our perceptual facilities are in good working order and functioning in the environment from which they were designed, we naturally trust that colors and shapes we perceive are real objects in a real world. The high value placed on empirical knowledge was one of the crucial preconditions for the rise of modern science. Christians had to stand against a long tradition going back to the ancient Greeks that had denigrated the empirical world as a shifting realm of shadows. For Plato, it was impossible to gain genuine knowledge of the sensory realm because it was the realm of appearance, not reality. Many historians suggest that this low view of the empirical world is one reason the ancient Greeks did not develop modern science, and why Christianity was necessary to lay the groundwork for empirical methodology of science. Rationalism. To counter rationalism, we can show that Christianity honors human rationality as a part of the image of God. It is no historical accident that the Middle Ages, when Christianity flourished, was the age of great rational system builders like Anselm and Thomas Aquinas. Their confidence in reason was unsurpassed because they regarded it as a gift from God. They were certain that the world is a creation of a reasonable God, and therefore it has an intelligible structure knowable by reason. Even today, as we have seen, Christianity stands for a unified, logically coherent truth against the upper-lower story divide that fragments modern worldviews. Christianity also stands against the matter of suspicion, who claim that human rationality is swamped by non-rational forces. The biblical God invites us to reason together, as said in Isaiah 1:18. Sanctification comes through the renewal of your mind, Romans 12:2. And the goal is to learn to love God with all your mind, Matthew 22:37. The word logic comes from logos, the word used to describe Jesus in John 1:1. The implication is that logic reflects the nature of God's own mind and character. Postmodernism. To counter postmodernism, Christianity offers an even more radical insight into the contingency of human knowledge. Postmodernism reduces knowledge claims to expressions of interest and power based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity. But the biblical teaching on idols cuts much deeper, to the ultimate spiritual commitments at the core of the human motivation. The Bible teaches the overriding factor in the choices we make is our commitment to a concept of the divine. Our lives are shaped by the God we worship, whether the God of the Bible or some substitute deity. In every area, Christianity encompasses the valid insights of all other worldviews while avoiding their weaknesses. It incorporates the best insights of idol-centered philosophies without falling into any limited, life-denying reductionism. This is genuinely good news. In fact, Christianity is so attractive that atheists keep reaching over and borrowing from it. In the next chapter, we will find out what makes Christian truth so appealing and why even atheists keep trying to claim parts of it for themselves. The end of section 4.